Oh, gut, wir sind jetzt online. Sehr schön. Guten Abend, liebe Schülerinnen und Schüler, liebe Lehrkräfte, liebe Interessierte. Mein Name ist Jasmin Nasruddin vom Deutsch-Amerikanischen Institut Tübingen und ich freue mich, Sie heute zum Vortrag zum Abitur-Schwerpunktthema der Ambiguity of Belonging und heute mit Fokus auf den Film Gran Torino begrüßen zu dürfen. Ich bin hier für die Schulprogramme zuständig und dementsprechend freue ich mich auch, dass das Thema dieses Jahr wieder online stattfinden kann. Schon gestern haben wir den Vortrag zu Crooked Letter anbieten können. Das finden Sie auch weiterhin auf unserem YouTube-Kanal bis zum Englisch-Abitur-Haupttermin. Das ist für diesen Vortrag heute Abend ebenso der Fall. Das heißt, bis zum 28. April können Sie beide Vorträge sowie die Lesung mit Tom Franklin, die wir im Februar durchgeführt haben, anschauen, reviewen und hoffentlich sich optimal für das Abitur vorbereiten. Falls das nicht ausreichen sollte, können Sie auch unsere Schülerkurse besuchen, die in den Osterferien stattfinden, also gerade vor den Prüfungen, um sich da nochmal vorzubereiten. Und falls Sie denken, ich brauche vielleicht noch ein bisschen mehr Unterstützung, sind auch Einzeltrainings mal möglich, gerade auch zum Beispiel in Richtung Kommunikationsprüfung, falls das noch relevant für Sie ist. Aber so möchten wir Sie rundum vorbereiten für das englische Abitur. Ansonsten möchte ich Sie auch auf unsere San Diego Jugendsprachreise hinweisen. Da haben wir noch ganz wenige Plätze frei. Sie finden alle Informationen, die ich jetzt gerade genannt habe, auch in unserer Beschreibung. Das heißt, einfach unten draufklicken, finden Sie alle Links. Wir bieten Kinder- und Jugendcamps an, die vor allem wahrscheinlich für Geschwister interessant sind, aber vielleicht möchten Sie ja auch als Volunteer dabei sein. Alles Weitere finden Sie, wie gesagt, auf unserer Webseite, auf unseren Social-Media-Kanälen. Und ich freue mich, wenn Sie ein Like hinterlassen und uns auch abonnieren. Das machen ja immer so die YouTuber und das können wir heute auch so machen. Dann würde ich eigentlich schon an unseren Sprecher schon übergeben, Grant Nichols, der den Vortrag heute Abend machen wird und auf Englisch. Und ich danke Ihnen, Herr Nichols, für die Zusage, dass Sie heute hier Abend da sind und übergebe an Sie.
You are very welcome. All right, so hard switch to English. Let's get it going. One moment, I'll share my screen and we can get the presentation started. Cool. All right, so I'm Grant Nichols. I'm from the d.a.i as well. I work as a teacher there, and I've been doing these Gran Torino presentations for the last couple of years. If there's any teachers in here with me, I'm pretty sure all of us are very excited to move on to the next topic, but that means you get the best, most refined version of my presentation and my thoughts on the movie. So let's get started. And we're going to have a questions round at the end as well. So teachers and students and anyone else, if you notice something that you find particularly interesting, notice something that you disagree with or that you agree with so much that you want to talk about it more, make sure to write it down, and you can ask a question in the channel, I think actually during the presentation, but we'll then field questions at the end, and I'll try my very best to answer them. Cool. Then, Gran Torino, 2008, by Clint Eastwood, acted in by Clint Eastwood, written by Clint Eastwood, everything's Clint Eastwood. So this is all about ambiguity of belonging, right? So how do the characters and their relationships in the film explore what it means to belong? This is the main thing, the main center point of the entire movie is belonging on a lot of different levels. Belonging to a gender, belonging to a culture, to a skin color, belonging to a country, to a neighborhood, to a city, and so on and so forth. It explores it in all of these different avenues, and that's what makes it a particularly good movie for Abi-Thema. And let's start with the character of Walt Kowalski, of Clint Eastwood's character, the main character of the film. So how would you characterize our protagonist at the start of the film? when and where do we get to know him, and what is his life like now that his wife is gone? Right at the beginning of the film, his wife passes away, and that's how the film starts, with her wake. I would describe him as bitter, angry, alone, blatantly racist as well, and encompassing this kind of grumpy, old, aging white patriarch that is disappearing within the movie. And that's a big part of the movie, is sort of disappearing and refinding oneself, not only for him, also for other characters. So as I said, he's at the end of his life. He's alienated from his last remaining family, right? You see right at the beginning of the film, he's extremely disappointed in his grandchildren. His grandson is acting out at the funeral and making jokes. His granddaughter is dressed way too provocatively, and he notices all of these things. And you get the sense just from some of the first text of some of the first lines of the film, when his son starts to speak, that he has this long history of being a neglectful, very overbearing father throughout his parenting career. So his relationship to his family is not great. He has, for all intents and purposes, no one in his life, right? He has his family in his life still, technically, but he's very distant from them in a number of different ways, in the ways that I just said, and they are also distant from him, right? You can see throughout the course of the film, sorry, I'm going to be jumping sort of forward and backward in the film to keep it thematically on point. You can see throughout the entirety of the film that his family would essentially like him to die at some point soon, right? The granddaughter would like him to die so that she gets the Gran Torino from him. And more metaphorically, the sons, there's the one scene where one of the sons and his wife try to convince him to go into a retirement home towards the beginning of the film. They want him not to die in that sense, but just to not be in their lives anymore. So in a way, in the sense of belonging, to not be alive anymore. His only real companion is his dog, which in my opinion is sort of a metaphor or a stand-in for his wife who passed away, who you can see through the beginning scenes of the film was really the last person that he had in his life that he genuinely belonged to. And even then, that belonging was very narrow. That I think you can see in, I think it is intuited, it is implied that his relationship with his wife was very positive. You know, he can't emotionally open up to anyone in the film, but he is able to talk to his dog as a stand-in for his wife about all of the emotional problems that he's having in his own very patriarchal way, but still you can see that they had an emotional relationship that he has not had with any other person through most of his adult life. And now that she is gone, he truly has no one. We get to know him, like I said, at the end of his life. So notions of life and death are very tools that are played with quite a bit in the film. He does survive his wife. He is the one that is still alive, but for all intents and purposes, he is dead in this sense of belonging, like I said. So the course of the film is him, in my opinion, coming back to life in order to physically die, right? So he's dying of cancer. You can see that at the beginning of the film when he starts coughing up blood, and it's implied that he has lung cancer and it's terminal and he's going to go at some point soon. And so his last wish before he goes is to find someone to belong to again, and in this metaphorical sense, be alive again. And that's what he gets with his relationship with Thao and with his family. Good. So I'd like to compare and contrast Walt's initial interactions with the family and with Father Yanovich, the priest that he talks to that helped his wife find her religious ends towards the beginning of the film, and the barber in terms of belonging as well. The family, like I said, he doesn't belong to in any way, right? They might as well just be people on the street to him. And they don't genuinely care about him either, right? So that belonging is completely cut. Contrasted to the barber, to whom he absolutely does belong, but in a very idealized way, I'll say. Right. So with his wife, he had a real connection and an emotional relationship, and you can see that now that she's gone, he really has lost any love in his life. But what the barber provides to him is the ability to continue to put on this mask of a masculine, white, working class, migrant background man, and to practice that even though he is losing that or has lost that everywhere else in his life. Right? His wife was the last one to really give him that sort of identity. And the barber, I think you can kind of consider it as this also disappearing area. The barber is not really a real character in the same way that like Thao or Sue or Walt are in and of themselves. He's only there to show that Walt has this mask on that he moves through life with. And, you know, he only really goes there pro forma. He doesn't actually need a haircut that often. He doesn't need a shave, but he gets one at the end of the film. So it's this kind of ideal zone that he can go to escape the fact that his actual identity in his real life is fading away. And in the middle is Father Yanovich. So to the character himself, he has absolutely no sense of belonging to, no connection to in any way. But Father Yanovich commands this sort of power over Walt because he was the one who guided his wife into the afterlife, and because he is the person that carries his wife's final wish with him, his wife's wish for Walt to find the same kind of peace that she found. Now, the peace that is being offered in death, right, because he's dying too, and what his wife wants and what Father Yanovich wants is for him to return to the church and find God and confess for his sins and to die a happy Catholic as his wife did. But you can see at the beginning of the film that that's not the path that he is going to take. He's very rejecting of religion. We'll talk more on that later, but Father Yanovich is in this kind of in-between zone between absolute alienation and this ideal sense of belonging that the barber offers. All right, so I'd like to move on to the setting, which is also of very great metaphorical importance. So where does the movie take place, and how does this play out for the story? The setting is in a working class neighborhood near Detroit. And, sorry, I thought I might have just muted myself, but I didn't. So how is this interesting for the sense of time and place in which the characters meet? So I'm not sure if, for the students, I'm sure the teachers know this, but if you know anything about Detroit, but Detroit used to be the center, the heart of American industrial, the center of American industrialization. It was the heart of the automobile manufacturing industry in America. So GM and Ford and all these big names had their factories there that they were making cars with, until they decided to use cheaper labor across seas and completely gutted the entirety of Detroit and the surrounding areas of all industry and moved it across seas in order to make more money, more or less. So what that left behind was a Detroit of extreme poverty. And that's been, since then, the main characteristic of Detroit. I think it has changed to a certain extent in the last 10 years, but the classic picture of Detroit in the modern era is of this similar sense of not really belonging to anything anymore, right? Detroit used to be the car center of America. It used to be the like working heart of America. That was taken away, and everyone that was left there, much in the same way that Walt is in the film, has lost their identity. They maybe still have a Gran Torino that they built for themselves, and that's the last little thing that they can hold on to that gives them a sense of identity, but everything material has left. Furthermore, it also signifies, so the area, Detroit, signifies a moment of era change as well. So in the same way that Detroit has changed from this industrial mecca into a deindustrialized sort of forgotten zone in America, so too does Walt's identity as this useful working class man from his generation also lose its sort of grip on reality, or lose its place in time. He's an artifact, he's disappearing. So his character, but also the person himself. Another interesting development in these terms is that as the industry moved away, you saw in Detroit more and more neighborhoods being filled with more diverse ranges of different migrant groups, which is represented within the film by the Hmong family that moves in next to Walt. So not only does it lose its identity as this working class capital that is tied to a booming industry, but it also loses its very white Anglo-European centric racial identity as well, and changes into a more diverse one. So what comparisons can be drawn between the former auto manufacturing capital and the okay, yeah, I answered my own question a little bit before that. But I'll reiterate one more time in one short sentence. Just as Detroit was left to fend for itself, both Walt as a working class white American and the Hmong people are ignored and forgotten in the time period and the place, both losing their former structures, right? Walt can no longer be this white patriarch that he has been his entire life. He's losing his grip on all of these different forms of his identity. And the Hmong family has lost a great deal of their cultural basis and don't have a definite place within society anymore. All right, now on to the most important symbolic artifact of the entire film, the Gran Torino, the reason that it was named this. And then I want to talk a little bit about this get off my lawn mindset that is very integral to American culture. So the Gran Torino itself works as a symbol for everything that's going on in the film. So it's a symbol of this masculinity and power, but of another time, right? It represents this independence, or this idealized independence, this idealized hard work, and this American meritocracy, pick yourself up by your bootstraps American dream. You know, you hear Walt say that he put the steering column in himself. He made his own car that he still drives to this day. And you can see how these things are going away as the Gran Torino represents this less and less as time moves on. You can see that the gang members, for instance, that want to steal the car don't see it as a symbol of independence or as something of earned through hard work or through some sort of meritocracy, but rather as this objectified power, as this initiation rite that Thao has to go through in stealing it to prove that he belongs to their gang. It also represents an industry in decline. There's this term, the Rust Belt. That's what the area where the industry was is called. It's called the Rust Belt because all the industry is still there and it's rusting because it's not used anymore. And so the Gran Torino also represents the decline of the Detroit industry. It's a physical artifact of the past. It's well built, it's hand built, it's American built, and so on and so forth. And in a world where those things are a rarity, even for Ford, right? Furthermore, it's a bridge between generations. It's a timeless classic. It has this intergenerational appeal. It represents both Walt's very outdated masculinity as well as Thao's entrance into adulthood, right? That's the first point where their ability to relate to one another really touches. And it's necessary to choose something like that because, as any of the teachers and younger students might know here, there aren't that many cultural things that typically older generations and younger generations can both appreciate. Something like a car, though, most people will look at and say, like, that's a good looking car. I would drive that 100%, whether they're 20 or 80. So I think that was a good choice as a symbol to get that first connection between Thao and between Walt. It's also the centerpiece of belonging. It's the seed of the conflict, right? It's an integral part of the gang initiation. And it is what ties Walt's sense of belonging to this working class history and to America, to him being an American citizen as well. And it is what is promised to Thao for him to also get his first sense of belonging, right? At the beginning of the film, Thao also doesn't really belong to anyone. And the gang says, essentially, hey, you can belong to us, and you just have to go and steal this thing. Not only is that an offer of belonging through violence, through a sort of violence, through theft, but it also is an offer for Thao to enter into adulthood, which is the main drive for his character throughout the film, right? He's trying to find a way to enter into adulthood. And he has these contrasting, these different, and yet very similar paths offered to him by the gang and by Walt. And we'll get into, I think it's very obvious how they're different, but we'll get into how they're similar very soon. If you contrast it with Walt's granddaughter, who essentially just wants the car and doesn't want to do any work for it and is sort of portrayed as being this spoiled brat who gets everything that she wants without having to really work at all, you can see that Thao has to put in the work in order to, or that work has to be put into belonging and has to be put into entering into adulthood. I think having that sort of annoying brat be a young woman in the film is representative of a critique that I have involving women in the film in general, but we'll get to that a little bit later, but keep it in mind. And lastly, it's a symbol of independence and interdependence that brings the main characters together, right? Like I said before, that's the pivotal moment. That's the thing that gets Walt and Thao to connect to each other in the first place. So I want to talk a little bit about this get off my lawn mentality and about violence in general. So get off my lawn is what an American says to another person that they would very much like to not have on their property anymore. And protecting your little square of land is something that's very, very deep in the psychology of the American nation, right? Whether it's in the first settlements, practicing genocide and trying to push the border ever westward and push the Native Americans ever westward, or if you look to the West during the gold rush when people would have a square of land that they would defend with violence because there was no police or sheriff or anything that would protect it for them. This notion of these are my four walls and I'm going to protect it with my life is very, very deep in the American psyche, and it's very linked to our weird relationship with violence. And in the film, violence is a tool that is used to create belonging. I think it's very easy to see how it does that with the gang members, right? They try to create belonging between them and Sue and them and Thao by rescuing them from this other rival gang when they're getting harassed by this other gang in the car, and the Hmong gang shows up and flashes their guns and tells them to go away, more or less. And through them convincing Thao to practice this other, not specifically violent act, but this kind of metaphorically violent act of stealing the car. And it's dangerous, you know, they know that he has a gun, they know that stealing is a potentially dangerous thing. What is less obvious is how violence has created a sense of belonging for Walt. And you can see this best at the end of the film, but I'll get to that in a moment. But his sort of very dominating patriarchal character is also representative of the sort of violence that was inherent to his generation. And I think it's summed up most specifically by his participation in the Korean War, right? His entire character is revealed at the end of the film, really circles around the immense amount of guilt and regret that he feels for having killed people in Korea. And a lot of his character is built up around managing that, about taking up this mask and sort of externalizing this violence that he has within him towards other people. A lot in a more metaphorical way, though, right? He does tell them to, you know, get off my lawn, and he threatens them and so on and so forth, but you can see you can interpret his neglect of his children, which is implied as a form of violence. His sort of racist attitudes towards the Hmong, and most likely towards there are also the African American characters towards the beginning of the film as a sort of violence as well, and so on and so forth. So a lot of his identity just revolves around this notion of violence. And in truth, the actions that he takes in the film cause a similar amount of violence that the gang members cause themselves, right? He plays an integral role in escalating the violence of the film. The gang members start it, sure, but if he doesn't come out with a gun and threaten them, if he doesn't go to the gang members' house and beat them up, then the entire climax of the film, when they do a drive-by on the Hmong house and when they assault Sue, doesn't happen. So he keeps reaching towards this violence that he's used to solve all of his problems throughout the entirety of his life. And at the end of the film, realizes that this kind of violence is not what will really get him this sense of belonging that he so very desires. One moment, I'm going to turn on a light. So what he's teaching Thao, I might be skipping ahead, but I'll just skip it later. I think I want to talk about it now. What he's teaching Thao when he's teaching Thao to become an adult is how to become an adult in the same way that he became an adult. And the way that he became an adult is very tightly linked to this violence that he practices throughout his life. And I think one of the core messages of the film is that this violence is this pacifist message that this violence only causes more violence, causes escalating violence, and causes people to be ripped apart more than it brings people together. Right? So you can see this in the climax of the film when the drive-by happens and when Sue does get assaulted, that Thao, who started off as this meek, weak character who has then turned into a young adult, is ready to grab one of Walt's guns and march out to the gang member's house and retaliate to escalate the violence more. And you can see in that moment that Walt realizes what he's done. He realizes that he's taught how to be a man in his own light and what he actually needs to, or in his own sense, related to this very deep connection to violence, when what he actually needs is to enter adulthood in a way that will not ruin him, in the same way that Walt's adult life, or Walt's entry into adulthood in the Korean War, as it's kind of inferred, has ruined his life. And so the climax of the film is he tells him, no, you can't do this. You can't be this. You can't be me. Locks him in the basement and goes and finds a pacifist solution to the entire problem through sacrificing himself to the violence of the gangs, which then solves everyone's problems, which I think is a little bit critical as well. But I think in terms of communicating that message is pretty good. All right. For all of the students, I have this slide that I will just let you write down for the next minute. If you'd like to copy down these key themes, I can talk about them while you're writing them down, but it's a lot of good stuff that you can talk about or write about, just in a list form. So I think fulfillment, right? How does Walt find this sense of identity before he dies? How does Thao find his way into adulthood is the main theme of the film. Finding purpose and finding happiness in much the same way. Masculinity and traditional values is very big, right? It is a film about belonging, but it is in a large way a film about how to belong as a man, right? It is a story about boys' entrance into adulthood, into manhood, which, as I noted earlier, is something I see a little bit critically. And transformation. How can Walt change from this bitter, angry, violent man into the very Jesus-like figure that he appears as at the ends of the film? Other themes include racism, xenophobia, and bigotry. That's pretty straightforward. All these racial conflicts between the gangs, all of Walt's racist attitudes towards the Hmong and towards the other minority characters in the film. Violence, crime, gangs, as I just talked about quite a bit. Death, destruction, and revenge, which I think falls under the violence theme, except for death, right? That also includes his wife's death and his own death. Religion and knowing yourself, I'll talk about that in the next slide. Psychological effects of war, friendship, family, patriotism, and changing times and intergenerational conflict. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hope you wrote it down. So, rejecting religion and finding fulfillment. From the beginning of the film, Walt rejects religion. What significance does this have? In rejecting religion, and the religion of his wife, and more specifically, her ability to find peace with her death through religion, Walt rejects his own mortality, both physically, right? He's old and sick and dying of cancer, as well as metaphorically, as a white working class patriarch. He cannot accept this religion because he cannot accept that he as a person is disappearing. Not only physically, of course, he's scared of his own death, but also metaphorically, right? His character as this white patriarch is disappearing. He is still there, but he's not important anymore. He doesn't have anyone he can fix things for anymore. He doesn't have anyone that he can be the leader of anymore. There's no meritocracy anymore. There's no industry that he can belong to, and so on and so forth. And I think this all ties back to this notion of him not really being alive at the beginning of the film, and that he only becomes alive at the end through his sacrifice for Tao's family. I mean, you can see that through his interactions with religious leaders in the film, the priest and the shaman that's pictured here, as well as metaphorically through his lung cancer. Walt is shown to be not really alive, right? He's controlled by guilt from his time in Korea and from his alienation from his family. I think he does experience guilt for that, and by the fear of loss of his identity and death. And he finds salvation for his sins not in the confessional booth, but in his final actions in protecting Tao's family. There's that really interesting scene at the end of the film when he goes back to talk to the priest one last time before he goes and sacrifices himself. And I think it's only interpretable in this kind of context, because it's a weird scene. He goes in and he confesses his sins. You know, he goes through the motions, but it's not the sins that the priest is waiting for. I think he confesses to like kissing a girl when he was younger and some other minor things that weren't really part of the film, but that were weighing heavy on his soul throughout his life. What that scene does show is that Walt has been able to find the sort of redemption, which is a very good word that you should write down if you don't know it already. R-E-D-E-M-P, redemption. Oh God, that's hard. R-E-D-E-M-P-T-I-O-N, redemption. He finds this redemption not through the same pathway that his wife finds in confessing her sins and dying in the light of God, but by sacrificing himself for Tao and for his family, and by giving up this violence that he's carried with him for the entirety of his life. So that last scene shows that he is, you know, ready to move on. And this surprises the priest because he was thinking that he would find his way back to church. But he still serves the same function that he did for his wife. He still is the person that he goes to talk to just before his death. Thought that was interesting. All right. Moving on to gender roles and being othered in that sense. So how are Hmong women portrayed? The grandmother is portrayed as kind of a woman equivalent of Walt, but she doesn't really have any character beyond just kind of being a Hmong woman version of Walt, right? There's that scene where he spits, she spits, and she gets to take care of his dog at the end of the film, but she doesn't really actually have her own character. Sue is the only real major female character in the story, and she serves the role as kind of an interpreter, as a symbol of morality, and at the end as a victim that needs saving, right? She is, through the film, portrayed as a relatively strong woman. She challenges Walt, and she's able to move with a lot of power within her own community, and is kind of, rebellious in that sense. But at the end of the day, she does pay the price for Walt's escalating the violence with the gang, and she needs to be saved from the gang by Walt and by Tao to a certain extent. She cannot save herself within this film. And that's my main problem with the film, is that I don't think that they handled the women characters of the film particularly well. I think you could have added a couple of scenes into the film to have it be a better in a lot of these senses. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Furthermore, the mother is also a relatively hollow character, doesn't really exist in the film. There's this saying that Hmong women go to university and men go to jail, so Sue has this bright future ahead of her. And she says, "I wish our father had been more like you," which also kind of feminizes the entire Hmong community, right? There are men in the community, you see them at the beginning of the film especially, but none of them are really there to take on the role that Walt takes on for Tao for some reason. It's not really said. More on my problems with the sort of gender politics of the film. I think it would have been better if they had included a scene at the end of the film that made it more explicit that Sue had to pay for Thao's entrance into adulthood, that all of this very violent air and attitude that Walt also practiced throughout the film resulted in her assault and her life being ruined in a lot of different ways. The way the film ends, I think people could interpret as like, oh, okay, now they're fine, the gang members are gone, so Tao's fine, Sue is fine. You know, she's recovering, she's standing, she looks okay, she looks happy that she looks sad that Walt is gone, and she looks happy that the gang members are gone. But you know, it's not really touched upon very much what kind of trauma she'll be carrying with her going forward. And I feel like if they wanted to, they could have made that more explicit very, very easily. Furthermore, the only person that's really offered an entrance into adulthood in the film is Thao, is not Sue. Sue is just one stable character. She doesn't change throughout the film. She's already fully formed, fully realized. Whether she's an adult or a child is kind of irrelevant for the film. But I feel like they could have also been a little bit more explicit with or included more character growth for her as well, because she is such a central character in the film, but not including a lot of the things that they do for Thao in his relationship with Walt kind of turns her into a tool, into a plot device that is used to help Walt get his redemption and to help Thao enter into adulthood. I see that kind of critically. The men in the film are obviously much more thought out in their display. The Hmong men are displayed as gangbangers or not at all. Thao is also displayed at the beginning of this film as in this very feminine light, right? He gardens and he cooks and everyone talks about him in his face and he doesn't stand up for himself. And Sue at some point even says that he does women's work and so on and so forth. That's another point where I think it's kind of sad that, you know, a main part of the film is that Thao is finding his own way into adulthood. And they don't, at the end, when he does find his own non-violent and non-hyper-masculine way to become a man, they don't include anything at the end of the film of him like gardening or cooking and being confident in doing so, which I think is kind of a shame. I feel like they could have shown that he found a way to be himself as an adult in that sense and not have just, you know, completely lost all of his character that he had at the beginning of the film. So further on their relationship, as a result of his societal status, Walt can kind of teach Thao how to be a man, how to earn a respectable living and be a reliable companion. And in doing so, Walt finds his meaning and Thao comes into his manhood. So let's go a little bit deeper into their relationship, the odd couple. What does their relationship teach us about what it means to be a man, or be an adult? How do they belong to each other, and why do they need each other? So entrance into adulthood requires guidance. That's something I would agree with, right? Every kid needs adults to guide them into adulthood in some way, shape, or form. But this does not necessarily require exact replication, right? The climax of the film is that Thao needs to become an adult in his own fashion at the end of the day. Walt has guided him, but he needs to become his own adult. He can't just become Walt 2.0. Otherwise, he'll go down the same path and wind up in the same bitter alley that Walt has wound up in. So Thao doesn't just take on Walt's outdated notions of what it means to be a man, he develops them himself. Thao is granted entrance into manhood, while Walt is the one that successfully challenges his notions of what it means to be a man in order to find salvation, right? So in terms of really deep character change, Walt is the one that actually changes very significantly by giving up this violence that I was talking about earlier. So Thao needs Walt to become an actor in his own life to enter adulthood, And Walt needs Thao to absolve him for his sins, his alienation from his family, the murder of Korean civilians, and so on and so forth. So what kind of masculinity is correct? The masculinity that Walt has developed during his life belongs to his time. The violence, his identity that doesn't go that far beyond usefulness, right? You can see at the beginning of the film that he's super duper excited to fix things. That's his first real entry into the Hmong house and into their life, is that he tries to connect to them by fixing their washing machine or fridge, the thing that they have in the basement. I can't quite remember. But you can see that he has this very outdated notion of a man's use is his usefulness. And initially, after Walt sees his avenue to redemption through his fatherly relationship to Thao, he tries to teach Thao a reactionary, outdated masculinity, the same one that served him in his life. In escalating the conflict with the gang members, Walt realizes that his definition of what it is to be a man is not the same one that will help Thao in his life. His violent approach to manliness can only lead Thao down the same bitter path that he has walked. Thao needs to find his own way, and this is echoed in the barbershop scene, where Thao gets the barber's approval not by following Walt's exact instructions, but by being confident in his own character. This scene is super duper important, because this is the first moment when the audience and Walt can see, oh, Thao doesn't have to be an exact replica of me in order to enter into adulthood, right? He tries to get Thao to come in and say racist things and be mean to the barber, and the barber is mean to him back, and so on and so forth, and they do hazing to him. But the scene ends with Thao coming in, and instead of trying again and doing the same hypermasculine thing that Walt wants him to do, making self-deprecating jokes about himself, right? He jokes about himself, puts himself down in a joking manner in order to make the barber laugh, and the barber laughs. And Walt is surprised. He's never made the barber laugh with that kind of humor before, right? He sees, oh, Thao is his own person. He is his own man in this sense. So the barber, the character that legitimizes Walt's identity, gives legitimacy to this alternate identity that Thao is representing here. And last but not least, notions of sacrifice and salvation or redemption, absolution, all these good biblical terms you can use for it. So Walt finds salvation in his sacrifice. But this is kind of problematic as well, in my opinion, for several reasons. Thao and Sue are not really actors in their own salvation. This still has to come from this white American patriarch, right? It still has to be Walt that saves him. I think it would have been more interesting if at least Thao was a part of bringing himself out of the situation that he finds himself in. As I mentioned before, Walt's sacrifice saves Thao from walking the same path as him, but Sue's trauma from being assaulted, for which Walt is partially responsible, will stay with her for the rest of her life. Her entrance into adulthood doesn't exist in this sense. And one final thing that I think that I see kind of critically is that Walt finds redemption without actually really repairing the damage that he's done to his own family, right? He obviously has a lot of things that he needs to clear up with his son's apologies to make. He could be a better role model for his grandchildren, but he decides to just be like, nope, I failed there. I'm going to concentrate on this other family. And finally, I think you can see in this final frame that Clint Eastwood probably thought of the character in some very religious terms, because he looks like Jesus on the cross here, which I think is a little bit heavy-handed in a lot of different ways. But that is it for me. Those are all of the things that I find particularly interesting and think are particularly important in the film. I hope I've been able to give you enough stuff to think about and talk about. And now, if you'd like, you can ask me some questions.
Great, thank you so much. I already posted it in the chat that they can now ask questions, so we will just wait for them to come in. It always takes a little bit. Okay, there is one question. Couldn't have Walt helped Thao in any other way in order to save him from the Hmong gang?
Yeah, he could have gone and just been extremely violent and shot up the gang and ended them in that way. But that's one thing that I think the film does really, really well, is that it shows that that avenue, the only real avenue of the film, is for Walt to show Thao his pathway to adulthood by sacrificing himself and by changing himself in this very deep way, in rejecting his violence. And so I think within the movie, in real life, yes. Within the framework of the movie, no. That makes sense. I don't think that all of the things that were brought up within the movie regarding violence could have been solved in any other way. So I'll say it that way. And in terms of belonging, yeah.
Yeah. Where can we see the influence of Clint Eastwood in the movie?
The fact that it is a hidden Western film, that he is, it has all of these things about belonging and so on and so forth, but at the end of the film, or at the end of the day, the skeleton of the film is sheriff rules over his small dusty town. Wild outlaws come into town, and sheriff saves the day but sacrifices himself in the process. So that's very, very Clint Eastwood. I think the ending is also probably pretty showing for Clint Eastwood's religious beliefs. Just the fact that he looks like Jesus once he dies and has made his sacrifice, is not necessary for the film. He spends the film rejecting Christianity, but he looks like Jesus at the end, which is out of place, and I think is probably more reflective of Clint Eastwood, or whoever else was co-writing the film. But I think those are two very major areas. And all of these like very hyper masculine, violence, classic man things are not only shown in this kind of critical light. Walt is kind of a cool person. I think it's very easy for someone who likes cowboy films to go into this and be like, yeah, Walt's cool, he's got a gun, that's really cool. You have to come and listen to someone who's watched this film and talk about it 100 times to maybe get the nuances of the film. But I think it's very easy to walk away from the film thinking like, yeah, cool.
The next question is, no, this is a comment. He could have also, so Walt could have also just killed the whole gang and then himself, which could have been.
I think that would have been a very interesting ending for sure to the movie, right? It has this very sort of specific buildup, but he definitely could have done that. I think that would have been a very big twist for sure. I would have liked to have seen how the characters would react to that.
In which way is the Gran Torino an aspect of belonging in the movie, especially in regard to Walt's former workplace?
So one thing that I didn't touch on quite as much is that the Gran Torino also represents him being a working class guy, being part of this like migrant community, right? Because he's Polish. It represents this belonging to your own hard work. And one thing that I didn't touch on quite as much is belonging to America as a country and as an ideal, right? I talked a little bit about the American dream, but a core and in my opinion, false ideal of America is that you can go there, and if you work hard enough, you can be the CEO. You can be at the peak. You can be at the tip of society and have anything and everything you want with enough hard work. And that's something that the Gran Torino represents to Walt, is that he really built it with his own hands, and now he has this beautiful treasure that everyone wants, right? He built that for himself. And the Gran Torino is also the last thing really linking him to this sense of the American nation as, you know, migrants move into his neighborhood, as the industry leaves, and as his wife dies, and as he's losing all of his other senses of identity. You know, that's the thing you can point to and be like, look at me, I'm an American man.
Ooh, this is a good question. Is Walt not racist anymore at the end of the movie?
That's a very good question. I actually don't think racism plays a huge role in the core of the film. I think they make him racist in order to have this kind of, you know, like he is explicitly racist. He says racist things. But then he turns around and is totally fine going to the Hmong family and hanging around in their house and, you know, interacting with her. Like a really deeply racist person is not going to go into that house in the first place. So I think they kind of used it just to show how angry and bitter and alienated he is from his surroundings. But that's actually one thing that I wish that they had explored a little bit more, is how to make Walt as a character more explicitly racist at the beginning of the film and show how he sort of softens up and is able to accept people that look different from him towards the end of the film. I think it's implied at the end of the film that race doesn't play that much of a role anymore, but I'm not even sure how much of a huge role it plays at the beginning of the film, other than just the words that he says, if that makes any sense. It's very superficial, the way that it's portrayed.
What role does Walt's gun play in the movie?
His gun, I would say, is a symbol of his own connection to violence, right? That's the gun that he killed the people in Korea with, and it's the gun that he uses to protect his four walls, his property with, when he escalates the violence with the gang members. And furthermore, it's what Thao wants when he goes to finally accept this violence adulthood that Walt has been teaching him through the entire movie, right? He goes and he wants to get the gun and he wants to go and kill the others. And I think in rejecting it and going and sacrificing himself instead of using the gun, he, you know, also metaphorically rejects violence in that sense. So I would see it just as a symbol of this sort of violent character.
Do you think that Walt finally found peace at the end?
His own peace, yes. Like I said, he doesn't find peace with his family, and he leaves a lot of loose ties that he doesn't really seem to care about. But yeah, I would say that that's the main point of the film, is that he is essentially a ghost that is floating around in what used to be his own life, and has to change himself to transform himself and find this kind of redemption in order to find peace and actually move on into the afterlife. So yeah, I would say yes.
Could the confession scene be seen as re-belonging to his dead wife and to Thao?
Yes and no. So you can kind of infer that what the wife wants for him is the same kind, that peace that we were just talking about with the last question, the peace that she has been able to find. Like, it's very inferred that she died relatively happy and fulfilled and sinless and in the light of God. And she wants that for Walt, and she only knows that through the church. So she wants him to do it through the church the same way that she does. Maybe she doesn't understand that he can't do that, but what she wants is that same kind of peace. So yeah, I could have said that earlier as well. I think the scene where he's talking to the priest at the end is also him communicating to his wife, like, hey, I found a way to find the same kind of peace that you have found. With Thao, don't really think he comes into the equation very much in that sense. Yeah.
Hey. What is your favorite character and scene in the movie?
That's a hard one. Favorite character. Kind of lame, but probably Walt, just because I've thought about him so much. He's the most interesting character. I think everyone else kind of has these flaws to them, but the changes that he goes through is very interesting. But the sort of side characters are also very likable in their own ways. The priest and the barber. I think my favorite scene. That's very hard to decide. Probably one of those like pivotal scenes when things when the characters really develop very significantly, like the scene when he takes Thao to the barber shop, or the scene when he meets with the priest at the end of the film. I think I like those moments in the film the most. It makes you think the most. If I had to choose.
Ooh. Okay, this is a question, and it depends on if you have read Crooked Letter, Crooked Letter. Could you compare the characters of Gran Torino to Crooked Letter, Crooked Letter? Any similarities, differences?
I have not read Crooked Letter, but I have heard about it quite a bit through teaching, sort of helping people prepare for Abi, but I have not put so much time into it. So I can't answer that very good. I have to try to remember what that book's even about. Nah, I don't think I can say anything smart about it. I'm
difficult.
sorry.
Yeah. And that is maybe for the students to figure out in their Abi.
Yeah,
and you can find an answer maybe in one of our Schülerkurse, or if you take Einzeltraining, it could be possibility to find out and work on that question. I don't see any other questions. If there are questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will also, as I did yesterday, put in the email address of Renton American, so you can ask your questions that might come up if you review this video or yesterday's video, and I can forward those questions to our speakers, and if they can't answer them, I will get back to you all. But otherwise, I would say thank you so much, Grant, for your really good presentation, your thoughts on the movie. Thank you to the participants for your questions. And good luck in your Abitur.
Good luck, everyone.
And have a good night, everyone.
Ciao.
Bye. Okay.